Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jacob Andreas, who is an associate professor at MIT in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department and also affiliated with CSAIL. Jacob's research is very interested in how to understand the computational foundations of language learning. Prior to joining MIT, he earned his PhD at UC Berkeley and his Master's of Philosophy from Cambridge. And he had a Bachelor's of Science in Columbia. He's received many awards like Sloan Fellowship, NSF Career Award, and more. But today, what I'm really excited to say is I'm really excited to actually see him teach us a really, really foundational aspect of what intelligence requires, which is, I think, a system that can ask questions. So with that, I'm going to let Jacob take it away and teach us how to ask questions.
So I want to start actually with a sort of very big question, which is in some sense the question of what machine learning is all about. Right? And as we're accustomed to presenting it in like intro ML classes, it's about building automated systems that can perform some sort of task for us where we specify what that task is via data, via input-output pairs that we want our system to be able to sort of replicate, maybe some unpaired data that tells us about the structure of the representation space, but ultimately examples of the behavior that we want to automate. As we all know, humans are actually quite bad at taking some sort of abstract idea about a behavior that they want to embody in some kind of machine learning system and translating it into a training data set that uniquely specifies that behavior. So here's actually an example from some recent work with some colleagues at MIT that we will be talking about again at the end of this talk, where if you take a model that's been trained on the ImageNet data set and you look at the set of images that get highly classified as beer glasses, beer glass being one of the classes in this ImageNet dataset. What you find is that when you train a classifier on ImageNet beer glasses, you get a classifier of men holding beer glasses and not women holding beer glasses, and not beer glasses in other kinds of contexts. So it is hard to go somehow from the sort of intention to build a beer glass classifier to a dataset that causes us to obtain a beer glass classifier. Now, as I think most of us understand now, the world today is maybe a little bit different from the world that we present in our intro machine learning classes. And then in particular, if we take this kind of example-driven technique and we use it to build not just any kind of classifier, but specifically a classifier that looks at a piece of text and predicts what words might come next in that text, which is to say a language model, then we wind up with a system in which we can start to specify new tasks, not with examples, but just with natural language instructions, right? That somehow once we've reduced the problem of next token prediction or text generation to next token prediction, this classification task, you can just place instructions in your context. And if you've trained on the right data, have those instructions be followed as the continuation of the text that you want to generate. So with language models, we now have a new tool for solving this sort of fundamental problem of machine learning, even if we don't have maybe any examples or many examples of the target task, we can specify the behavior that we want just with language, right? We can give instructions, and if we have big enough and capable enough models, they will follow those instructions. And I think maybe especially important for this audience, this is true even if the desired behavior in question isn't language as such, but really anything that we can specify or anything that we can serialize as a sequence of text tokens, whether that's a paragraph of text or a task plan that exists in some sort of symbolic form, or even a sequence of sort of low-level discrete actions for some low-level controller that we know how to steer. At the same time, as anyone who's worked with a language model knows, it's also very hard to get a language model to do what you want by writing the right prompt. Here's an example from a relatively recent paper, not picking on this paper, it's a cool paper, but where they note in a footnote somewhere that changing, in a sort of subtle way, the wording of a prompt completely makes the difference between the system working and not working. And so somehow it's also hard for us to build good enough mental models of language models to figure out what kind of text we need to put into them in order to get them to execute the behaviors that we want them to execute. Now, if we abstract away from all of this, what machine learning is really about, or at least what I think we want it to be about, is building systems not just that do sort of as we do by example, not just that do as we say by issuing instructions, but really about building methods that can go from the intentions that live in our heads as system builders or as users of these systems into automated processes that operationalize those intentions. And, obviously we're not quite there yet, but what this talk is going to be about is maybe some first steps that we might take towards getting there. And I think before we do this, it's useful to spend at least a little bit of time thinking about how people solve the analogous problem of figuring out sort of how to act in the world, and what it is that the other people around us want us to do or think we should do to obtain the best outcomes for ourselves. Right, and we do this by observing the world passively. We do it by paying attention to the behavior of skilled teachers. Maybe most importantly, if we're interested in human-like intelligence, we learn from language. And language not just that tells us what to do, but how to do things and why, and what the world is like in maybe a general way. And when we think about learning from language, and this is, I think, the last of slides that will just have nice paintings on them before we get into some substantive content. When we think about learning from language, we're normally thinking about something like a language model pre-training, right? Learning to generate text that looks like all of the text that we have seen before. And maybe the sort of central theme of this talk is that language is not just a passive source of information for learning, but really a tool for gathering information. Our teachers, when they are trying to teach us, use language to figure out what it is that we need to know and to communicate to us what it is that we need to learn next. And we, as learners, when we sort of know that we need some piece of information that our teacher doesn't know we need, use it to ask questions and acquire those pieces of information that basically only we can figure out are going to be useful to us at some particular moment in time. Now, I think we've learned a lot in the last decade about how to train big things that look like LMs on big pre-existing data sets, but I think if we really want to make good on this dream of building systems that sort of figure out what we mean and do that, we're going to need some way of going from the models that we have right now to models that are equipped with the ability to learn very efficiently from small numbers of interactions with human users, or maybe even aspects of those interactions are being driven by the models themselves. Now, this talk is mostly going to focus on how to structure these kinds of interactions in the first place, how to basically get information out of users' heads or into users' heads efficiently. I want to note briefly that I think there are also a bunch of really interesting technical problems that are more related to continual learning, how you take a sort of free-form natural language interaction with a user and pack it into a model in some sort of persistent way that causes it to remember everything that it learned. And I, would love to talk more about that maybe offline. I want to say also that even though this is the robotics seminar, this is not really a robotics talk. I can promise you one robot video about 2/3 of the way through. But it is about interactivity in a broad sense. And I think actually the physical world is where many of these problems of specifying behavior are sort of most acute, and therefore where systems that can sort of participate in rich interactions with human users, maybe even sort of on agent initiative, are the right way to build robots that can do what we want. Good. So on this theme of learning interactively, the talk is going to have two parts. The first about building automated systems that use natural language interactions to learn, and then the second about building automated systems that use natural language interactions to teach, but actually to learn a little bit about the learners in the course of teaching well. So jumping right into this first section, talking here about a few papers in collaboration with a bunch of other colleagues at MIT and various other institutions, led by the amazing group of student authors in the top row here. And the sort of high-level question that we're going to be asking in this first section, as sort of alluded to before, is how we efficiently and maybe precisely transfer some sort of task specification from a person's mind into a model's parameters, or into some piece of data from which a set of model parameters can be derived. Now, at the outset, it is very important to note here that people have been asking some version of this question for a very long time, measured on the scale of the history of machine learning, and there are some pretty good mathematical tools at our disposal here. In particular, there's a long line of work on both active learning and optimal experiment design, or sort of Bayesian optimization, that try to figure out how to construct good data sets by picking the most informative examples to label. And so you can think of these kinds of methods as saying the way in which we're going to train a machine learning system is we're going to have some kind of automated process that runs in the background that basically at every turn of the interaction is asking, what is the best question that I could ask to the human user right now, subject to the constraint that basically the only kind of question that you're allowed to ask is, here is an X, can you tell me what the associated Y is? And, maybe the sort of point of living in a world with language models, or a thing that's useful about living in a world where we have really good language generation systems, is now we can start to ask, or we have sort of automated systems that can start to generate more interesting questions. So what can we do with these things? And as we start to dive in here, I think it's an interesting maybe note about the behavior of current like LMs that exist out in the world, if you've sort of interacted with a ChatGPT or Claude, that they very rarely ask questions when you give them bad or underspecified instructions. They will, there was a sort of period during which they would just pick one interpretation and go with that. There was a period during which they would, sort of figure out what the source of ambiguity was and answer every possible version of the question that you thought you might have been asking in a way that was quite annoying and hard to read. This is starting to change a little bit, but for the most part, it's still the case that these models are not trained to participate in interactions before following user instructions. They just follow the instructions. And maybe the important thing to point out there is that this is at some level like a product decision rather than a fundamental property of an X token predictor. It maybe anticipates the fact that the sort of systems that we interact with now are going to be embedded in pieces of software where a user might not even know that they're interacting with a language model rather than some other thing. But because it's a choice that we can get around. And so the very first question that we're going to ask here is that, if we were to actually just forget everything that we knew about active learning and Bayesian optimization and whatever, how well can we do at this task of eliciting specifications from human users for model behavior if we just try to get off-the-shelf models to do it? And so all we are going to do in this first set of experiments that we look at here is take some sort of off-the-shelf LM. We're going to prompt it to interview a user about what it is that they're trying to get the model to accomplish, maybe using questions in some particular style. And once this interview is done, we're just going to take the transcript of the interview, we're going to concatenate it all together, stick it into the input to the model again, and ask it to perform the target task conditioned on the interview. We're going to also, and because there's actually nothing technically interesting here happening at all, we're going to see the experiments very quickly. The evaluation scenario is pretty different here from a normal machine learning task. The way we're going to do all of these experiments is we are going to first have the user have this sort of open-ended interaction with a model. And only then are we going to show the user an unlabeled test set. We're going to ask them to label the test set however it is that they think it ought to be labeled. And then we're going to compare the model's labels on that specific user's annotated version of the test set to the ones that the user produced themselves. Okay, so, this is obviously a very general paradigm. We could imagine applying it to a lot of kind of knowledge-intensive or algorithmic tasks. Here we're going to be focused specifically on things that look like personalization. So small task families where we expect there's going to be a lot of variation between individual annotators that we therefore would, sort of in the real world want to be able to elicit really efficiently. So we're going to be looking here at 3 different domains, a sort of content recommendation domain where the system's trying to figure out what set of websites or news articles a person is going to like, an email validation domain where we're basically sort of simulating the process of building some sort of formal specification for a piece of software by eliciting a human's judgments about what kinds of email addresses are well-formed or malformed, whether or not those actually correspond to the official specification. And finally, a set of moral decision-making tasks where we're trying to predict the conditions under which an individual user is going to think it would be sort of morally acceptable to steal a loaf of bread. Good. So the first thing to notice in this paradigm is that you can actually get like pretty good questions just off the shelf. I think these experiments are all looking at GPT-3, but we had similar results with a Mistral model as well. So here is the content recommendation domain. The system says, what kinds of online communities do you participate in? The user says, well, I like to browse Reddit. And this model actually knows enough about, Reddit and the structure of Reddit to start drilling down into that and saying, okay, tell me about the specific subreddits you're interested in. So really like a relatively rich model of the outside world and the way the outside world might interact with the user's preferences in a way that allows it to generate, from like turn 2 of this conversation, pretty user-specific interactions that we think might be informative. And we see similar things in this bread stealing domain and in this email domain as well. Now, one question before we even get into the question of how well the model has actually learned the user's preferences from these interactions is whether we can meaningfully figure out whether we're eliciting humans' preferences in the first place. You could imagine, for example, that somehow as a result of interacting with a language model about one of these topics, the user's preferences are changing in some way that what we're eliciting is not actually the user's own preferences, but the language model's preferences as they were conveyed to the user or whatever. So what we're looking at on this slide is at the level of individual test items in our data set, what is the fraction of human users who answered yes or no, who sort of labeled that example with a yes or no in the test set, without interacting with the language model versus after being interviewed by the language model. Obviously, in a perfect world, we would do the within subjects version of this experiment where you had the LM interaction, we erase your brain, and then we go back and have you not do the LM interaction, or we show you the test set, we erase your brain, and then you label it again after talking about the language model. We can't do that, but we can at least see that in aggregate, at the population level, really people don't seem to change their preferences as a result of interacting with this model. So probably whatever it is that we're measuring here is pretty close to the distribution of preferences that people start with before these interactions. Okay, good. More importantly, does it actually work at figuring out what it is that people want? And the answer is sort of. So what we're looking at in all of these plots is the sort of area under the interaction time versus accuracy curve. So what we're actually doing is we're taking sort of slices of these conversation at like 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minutes. I think the interactions are all capped at by time rather than tokens, so like 5 minutes of interaction. And we're seeing basically how accurate are the model's labels on this test set based on the prefix of the conversations that we've had up till some moment in time. And so you do well on this metric by getting all the answers right, and you do well on this metric by getting all the answers right early rather than late. So if you can ask questions more efficiently, you'll score well here. And in this content recommendation domain, it works better than, modestly better, we should say, than asking, sort of picking a set of random examples and asking the user to label them, using a sort of standard active learning technique that is known to work well in this sort of language model and context learning setting, and better than just giving the user 5 minutes on their own to write a prompt that somehow describes their preferences for content recommendation. So maybe some signal that something positive is happening here, but less so in the other two domains. So in the email domain, where there isn't really like a natural distribution over emails that we can sample from, we can really only compare to a human written specification. And here we do significantly better than that, but we also fail to reject the hypothesis that it was better to simply not have this interaction at all and let the model go with its initial guess about what a well-formed email is. So pretty mixed there, and also pretty mixed in this moral reasoning domain where you do better than chance, but not necessarily better than asking people to just write down their preferences in some prose form. Good. So a sort of natural question that this raises is, can we do better, right? We have maybe some preliminary evidence that this kind of prompting thing works, that people are kind of able to express their preferences about these domains in language. But at this point, we're kind of out of things that we can do with an off-the-shelf language model. So what is it going to take to actually build better interactions than the ones that we're getting natively? So let's come back to thinking about our active learning and experiment design, optimal experiment design methods again. And the basic idea behind many of these approaches is to build some kind of explicit probabilistic representation of some posterior over weights of the function that we are eventually trying to learn that does the labeling, right? And so what we're going to do at every round of this interaction is we're going to say, here's a distribution over possible parameters of my final model. What is the example that, if labeled, in expectation, right, with respect to my current beliefs about what the labeling function ought to be, is going to be maximally informative? And you can think about maximally informative in a couple of ways, all of which are equivalent to each other, right? What is going to reduce my posterior entropy about the parameters of the model I'm going to learn? What is going to sort of maximize the KL divergence between the parameter estimate that I have now and the one I'm going to have in the future? Or what is the mutual information between the answer to my question and the parameters of the model that I'm eventually trying to learn? And these are all exactly the same thing. So what does it take to apply this recipe in things that look like the dialogues that we were just looking at a minute ago in these sort of prompted interactions with the model? And I think there are two sort of important challenges that we have to address here. The first is that we need a predictor whose parameters we can represent a posterior over, right? In our language model interaction, there's no sort of thing that lives in the language model or that lives in the dialogue history or whatever that you can point to and you can say, this is a representation of the model that I have trained based on what the user has seen so far. In some sense, the context is the specification of the model, and that specification doesn't come with any explicit notion of uncertainty. And the second is that we need some way of handling training data Oh yeah, and so I guess I should say on that first point, right, the way this works in these sort of classic active learning methods or whatever is we just make very strong parametric assumptions about the form of the predictor that we're trying to train. Typically, it looks something like a linear model, where it's relatively easy for us to reason about the space of possible linear model parameters. The second challenge here is that our training data now, in general, is not going to look like the sort of input-output pairs on which we want our model to act at test time, right? We have sort of freeform interactions with the user at training time, but we have, specific websites about which we want to make content recommendations or whatever at test time. So to sort of get past these limitations, we're going to do this in a couple of steps. The first thing we're going to show is how to make this work by making some really strict assumptions about the form of the predictor that we're going to train and the kinds of questions that we're allowed to ask. And then we're going to relax those assumptions to allow ourselves to work with more interesting predictors and hypothesis spaces. So the first thing that we're going to do here is really focus on this problem of how to take the sort of tools that we already have basically for training linear models and let them apply to more complicated kinds of inputs that don't necessarily have representations as feature vectors. The fundamental challenge here, right, is that we want to get language model judgments about complicated things like text documents, but we only know how to explicitly compute informativity for sort of parametric models that, don't look like the parameters of language models or certainly the prompts of language models, and only for some kinds of questions. And so we're going to use LMs again here, but in a slightly different role, in the role of a sort of task formalizer. And what this is going to mean in practice is that we're going to first sort of prompt our model with a description of the problem domain in which we're operating and ask it to come up with just a set of abstract features in terms of which a user's preference function might be designed. We're then going to use that feature representation to sort of translate back and forth between whatever actual objects we're trying to get judgments about, news articles or whatever, and abstract feature representations that we know how to do active learning or experiment design over or whatever, while using, again, these sort of classical techniques to figure out what the best questions to ask are for figuring out the parameters of this linear model, and then basically repeat this cycle and predict with the model that we trained composed with a sort of LM-based featureizer at test time. So to be a little bit more precise about this, right, what we're going to do here, right, like we said before, is start off by asking an LM to build some sort of feature representation of our domain in this content recommendation domain we've been looking at. It might include features like what's the topic of the article, what's the style of the article, what's the length of the article, and so on. And once we have a fixed set of features in terms of which we think our user preferences are going to be defined, we're just going to initialize some, Gaussian prior over the parameters of a model that predicts in that feature space. And now, at every turn of the interaction, we're going to ask, in terms of the parameters of this linear model, just what is the most informative pairwise comparison that I could make between any two feature vectors? So if I have an abstract, sports feature and an abstract current events feature, the questions might be, how do I feel about the feature vector that has a 1 in the sports position and a 0.1 in the current events position versus a 0.1 in the sports position and a 1 in the current events position? And this is something that we can compute relatively efficiently because we have a pretty simple model. Now, you could imagine just taking this feature vector and going to the user and saying, hey, how do you feel about 1 current events, 0.1 sports relative to 0.1 sports, 1 current events? And the user's going to say, I have no idea what you're talking about. I can't imagine what such a question could possibly mean. But we can get automated systems, sort of the same language model that did this coming up with the features in the first place, now to translate these abstract feature vectors into concrete examples of articles that people are actually able to reason about. And so what we're going to do with this next step, once we have a pairwise comparison that we're interested in making, is just synthesize a fake news article that has the right feature vector for each side of this comparison and ask for a judgment about these two synthesized articles. And we're going to interpret that then as a judgment in this more abstract feature space that our predictor has defined. Because we can do that, we'll then just update our posterior to reflect whatever judgment we got out of the human user, and we'll repeat this process over and over again, and what we'll get at the end of this is some estimate of what the user's features are in terms of, or what the user's preferences are in terms of this feature vector, or feature function that we defined. Now, notably, right, at no point in this entire process has the user actually seen a real news article. At this point, all of the data that they've seen is fake data that's been synthesized by a model based on fake preference data, or, fake features that the model came up with at the beginning of the interaction, and preferences that were imputed about those features. At test time, now we're going to have some real articles, and so we're going to have to ask our LM to featureize those real articles in terms of this feature function that we defined before, and then score them and use those to make content recommendations to the user. Questions about how this basic loop works? Yeah.
How do you choose the pi?
I think it is literally a standard normal.
0b?
Yeah. Because we don't even really know what the interpretation of any of these features is going to be. Okay, so how does this do? Lots of data on this slide. I actually want to go from right to left here. So this rightmost pink baseline is the same sort of open-ended questions for content recommendation method that we were looking at in the previous set of results. This is a new user population. This is actually a slightly different test set, so we're replicating the main finding there. That if you just get the LM to do open-ended questions, you can do non-trivially at this particular task. Interestingly, if you restrict the model to ask only these kinds of pairwise questions that our fancier method is able to generate, it's actually quite bad at coming up with, or as we're going to see in a minute, maybe interpreting the results of those pairwise questions. This doesn't do better than just sort of guessing what the average user is going to do in all situations. Similarly, if we use our fancy question asking method to ask a bunch of questions and then we hand that off to the LM is not actually able to do a good job of labeling the test set for any individual user. Just as a sanity check, we did a sort of additional experiment here where we just showed the user the list of features and asked them to rank them or assign them scalar scores without showing them any articles. And people are bad at this, and you also don't do any better with people's sort of handwritten predictors this way than you would basically not doing anything at all. And it turns out the two things that work are either letting the language model ask kind of open-ended questions, letting the language model ask pairwise questions, and then fitting a little linear model to those pairwise questions, using whatever feature function the model itself came up with at the beginning of this procedure, or doing the full loop that we described before. And so I think an interesting thing here is that one way of reading this is in some sense, a failure of in-context learning, right? That we know there's information in this set of question-answer pairs that from which information about the user's preferences can be derived, enough information that even if it's the language model asking the questions, we can fit a little linear model to those, but that the model itself is not able to just sort of directly condition on the text here. So following these instructions or following these specifications is in some sense hard. Okay. So, sort of continuing on where we left off before, right? Can we get better models or more sort of efficient and informative interactions by asking better questions? And we saw a super lockdown method that could do this by sort of pre-committing to a fixed question format, pre-committing to a fixed form of our final predictor, and pre-committing to a specific question type. But as a result of this, we were at least able to do something that looked like sort of active learning in a space now of synthetic free text documents that we want to recommend to a user. So the sort of natural question at this point is, how do we scale up to more interesting kinds of predictors and more informative kinds of questions? So starting with the high-level overview and doing this in more detail again, the first thing that we're going to do here, as in the first version of this method that we looked at, is go back to letting the model ask the questions, right? And we can maybe justify this even by the fact that we could derive from questions that the model was asking a good predictor, even if the model or the language model itself couldn't. But at this point, we're going to ask the language model in every conversation turn not to just generate a single question, but a very large number of questions that might be sort of contextually appropriate given everything that's been said so far. And we're going to take each of those questions pairwise, and we're going to translate it into some kind of scoring function, some kind of potential function that can now look at an individual input-output pair and score it for well-formedness. And so our predictor now is going to be implicitly defined by the collection of all of these potential functions, each of which is going to look at sort of input-output pairs when we're trying to make final recommendations and tell us whether the output is good for the input. And what's nice is that because we now have some slightly more explicit representation of the prediction rule that our model is using, right, that every question that we ask is going to correspond to a separate scoring function, we can ask now for each of these scoring functions how much it's going to reduce our uncertainty about the labels of future data points in expectation. And we can therefore, sort of compute the informativity of each of these questions in terms of the informativity of the associated potential function and pick the best one. And so we'll just sort of loop that over and over again until we're pretty sure we know what the user wants. And like we said before, now we'll make final predictions by scoring candidate outputs using basically the product of all of these little potential functions. And we'll see this in slightly more concrete detail momentarily. Now, before we do that, slight change in the data distribution and the experimental paradigm. I'm not going to be talking about this today, but there's a whole angle on this project that is also about the sort of cognitive science of how people ask questions. And we're therefore working with an experiment paradigm that was originally developed by Brendan Lake's group for sort of looking at human question asking using the kind of classic game of Battleship. Hopefully this video will play. The sort of basic setup we're using here is that the person's job is to figure out where a bunch of ships are located on this board. But in addition to firing at the board, they are allowed to ask arbitrary questions in natural language as long as those questions have yes/no answers. And so think of the function that we're trying to learn now as a function that assigns to every sort of position on a 64 by 64 grid some sort of label that says you're a ship of a certain color or you're empty space. Okay, so how do we sort of implement, maybe in slightly more detail, this recipe that we were talking about before? We said before that the sort of modeling of the uncertainty was going to be one of the major computational challenges here. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to have some sort of like particle-based representation of the full labeling function, or you could think of it as a particle-based representation of possible like sets of labels that could be assigned to individual board cells in the context of this like Battleship game. Think of this as basically the model is now going to hold in its head just a set of possible boards that are consistent with all of the interactions that we have had so far. And at every step of this interaction, it's going to sort of winnow down the set of boards to be distributed according to the weights suggested by our potentials. If you've seen any kind of sequential Monte Carlo method, we're just doing that and the sort of standard tricks apply. And now during the interaction, right, at every step of this interaction, we're going to get the language model to generate a bunch of questions by just sampling from some prompted version of the language model that says write down a good question. And off the shelf, right, with most modern models for this Battleship game, you get interesting and like pretty sensible things, right? Are there any ships in column 2? Are there at least 2 ships in columns 1 through 4? Are any of the ships in contact with each other? And so on. For these Battleship experiments that we're going to look at right now, the way we're going to construct these little potential functions is actually as pieces of code. And so for each of these questions, we're going to translate it into a little Python program that looks at a board and tells us whether that board is consistent with a question-answer pair. What's nice about this is that we, don't have to make sort of hard distinctions. We can model this board labeling process as being a little noisy in case the human participants of these experiments just like make mistakes when answering questions, which they definitely do. And you could imagine really instantiating this in any other way. These could even just be sort of the language model prompted again to look at a question-answer pair and a particular input-output pair and say, do these things go with each other or not? All we need is some way of looking at a QA pair, looking at an input-output pair and assigning them some kind of score. Once we have this, we're going to take each of these translated questions that we got before. We're going to look at our set of boards that we were holding in our head as a representation of our belief about the function that the user wants us to learn. And we're just going to reweight this set of things according to the scores assigned to them by these programs that we wrote. And, for the Battleship, these are mostly going to be kind of 0, 1 plus a little noise things, but we can also do softer versions of this if you have softer notions of whether an answer is acceptable or not. And then we're simply going to choose to have our model ask at the next turn the question that we thought was most informative in the sense of sort of reducing most the entropy of this posterior that we're maintaining over functions that the user wants us to learn. And then we'll just, we'll ask the question, we'll observe the answer, we'll reweight our real distribution, and rinse and repeat. Now, the first thing to look at here is just that the questions that we can ask And the code that we have to write in order to instantiate these questions can actually be quite complicated, right? So we're writing, sort of non-trivial, like 20, 30 line functions sometimes, even just as translations of simple English sentences for simple English questions for asking questions about the board. And so, I think the thing that I really want to emphasize here, right, is this is in some sense like a totally vanilla active learning loop of the same kind that we would have written down 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 25 years ago. And the only difference is that now when we're thinking about labeling functions and labels that we're eliciting from users, we can consider not just the space of sort of examples that we have in some pool of examples, but this like enormous combinatorial space of 30-line Python programs, right? Almost all of which are not even well-formed in the first place, and most of which are not going to be informative at some particular moment in the conversation. But basically, because we have models that have really good like priors about what questions might be appropriate at some moment in a conversation, and some way of formalizing those questions as scoring functions that we can use to then get an explicit representation of how much they reduce our uncertainty, suddenly we're able to do active learning in this just like unimaginably complicated space of possible functions that are like products of non-trivial Python programs. And so this is pretty cool. And again, it's not just about Python. We can like really any kind of scoring function that you can imagine generating or constructing from a model we can do in this way. Okay, so here's what a game looks like in practice. And I'm really realizing now that the text in the top right corner is white on a light background and might be very difficult to read. It says, is the orange ship oriented horizontally? Is the orange ship in A, B, or C? Is the leftmost tile of the orange ship in 1 or 2? Is the red ship oriented vertically? And now it's just going to go basically like win this game after asking a relatively small number of questions that it turns out, if you look at the actual posterior that's associated with this, like more or less fully specify the location of all these ships with a very small number of questions. Right, so these gray cells are the misses, and notice that basically there were very few misses. Okay, so in terms of sort of quantitative results, which are maybe the least interesting thing here, the plot on the left you should think of as sort of the like classification accuracy. Every time the model had to explicitly like try to assign a label to a cell, what was the probability that the cell contained a ship? Humans get an F score of 0.65, 0.7 on this task. And various versions of our method, which are these Bayes things over on the left-hand side, achieve superhuman accuracy at this task. And in particular, the sort of fully instantiated thing, which is this rightmost plot, you can take even like a relatively small off-the-shelf LM. This is like the small Llama 4 model. You can do way better than humans. And interestingly, you can even do way better than GB5 equipped with even some amount of the sort of question-asking scaffolding that we've described here. And so just by building in some explicit representation of this posterior over possible functions that the user wants us to implement, we can take what's like objectively a pretty terrible language model by today's standard and make it, not that anyone cares about this, like the best player of this weird version of Battleship that we have, I think that has been created before. And the plot on the right here is just showing that you also get nice inference scaling behavior. The more questions you sample at every time step in this interaction, the more informative your questions are and the better you do at the game. Okay, just to close out this section, I want to give one more example of something that you can do in this basic paradigm, and here's your promised robot. Say we're trying to learn a cost function for some kind of new robot skill. We really want to minimize the number of demos that we need to get from a person, and hopefully the amount of engineering that the person needs to do to properly interpret those demonstrations, which means ideally what we want to learn is like a very simple cost function, parameterized in terms of a very simple number of features, such that the weights of that cost function can be learned with maybe one demo, or not very many demos. And we can do something that looks like this using basically the same loop that we've been looking at before. What we're going to maintain uncertainty about now is our feature set. And we're incrementally going to get a model to propose new features and weights for those features, show the user a demo that is sort of optimal for that set of features and weights. And then, if they're unhappy with the demo, they can make a correction or just say, I don't like this, or we can do pairwise comparisons and ask them to pick their favorite. And then we'll go back and figure out, okay, what is maybe now the new feature that we need to explain, the new feature or the new sort of feature weight pair that we need to explain the user's preferences as they've been expressed so far, and then go back and replan, with this new cost function over and over again. So here's an example of this working in practice. This is probably going to be illegible without some context. The main thing to notice here is that this model has learned that its cost function is defined by avoiding the distance to the book. This is a super high-dimensional space. The robot is aware of all of the other objects on the table and in the room and whatever else, but the language model was able to guess that of all of the sort of relations that you could try to featureize, or joint angles or whatever that you could try to featureize, the one that is likely most relevant to specifying the cost function is the one that talks about the distance between this wet rag and the other objects that are on the table. Cool. So to sort of wrap up here, I think the high-level takeaway is that learning from these kinds of free-form interactions with human users can, in some cases, be more accurate and less cognitively demanding than asking people to sort of write down their own textual descriptions of preferences or doing any kind of supervised data labeling. At the same time, it seems to be the case that the kinds of off-the-shelf text generation systems that we have access to now are not actually that good at asking or interpreting QA data of this kind, and benefit actually quite a lot from even just a little bit of scaffolding. I'm realizing that it's 3:15 and I have a whole other section that I want to go through here. Okay, cool. I will. Okay, I think I can do the next bit in 10 minutes. Okay, so to shift gears just a little bit. So far, we've been doing this all kind of from the student's perspective, right? Trying to figure out if we're trying to learn a new function, what information is going to help us learn that function most efficiently. In many kinds of real-world interactions, the asymmetry actually goes the other way, right? The sort of person who's providing the supervision, the teacher, knows more about the structure of the hypothesis space or the target task or whatever than the student. And it's therefore sort of the teacher that should be coming up with practice problems or examples or something for the student to cause the student to learn as quickly as possible. This is especially important in educational applications, which my student Alexis is especially interested in. And so this last piece of the talk is going to focus on this sort of inverse question of how an expert should choose a good example for training a student. The running example we're going to use in this section is going to be about teaching fraction arithmetic. If you remember back to the first time you were trying to learn fractions, there were a bunch of seemingly arbitrary rules about when you're supposed to make the denominators agree with each other and when you can just sort of apply the right operation on both sides. The interesting thing here is that the space of student misconceptions, if you look at the sort of educational literature, is actually quite structured. And there are sort of systematically handfuls of misconceptions that most students will have over and over again, such that if you're the teacher, really what you're trying to do if you're interacting with a student is to map them most of the time onto some pattern of misconceptions that you've actually seen before. And if you can do that, if you can figure out what your student is confused about, then you can sort of design for them appropriate practice problems or whatever else. And, not just to the level of you need to work on multiplication and you need to work on addition, but you're specifically confused about what happens with this pair of numerators, or you're also bad at multiplying large numbers. So if I want you to learn this other skill, I should give you small numbers and so on. And so I think the main point here is that being able to adapt to your students' prior beliefs before you get into a task is really important to providing informative examples. And so if you want to teach effectively, you need to both sort of infer what was in your student's head at the beginning of the interaction in a way that maybe governs how they interpret whatever examples you're using to teach them. And you need to be able to infer, halfway through an interaction what they have learned from those examples that you provided, which is something that will have been determined in general by whatever their prior was. What we're going to be looking at here is a kind of online learning paradigm where the interaction is as follows. We have a teacher, we have a student. The student is drawn from some set of sort of clusters of misconceptions that students are known to have. The teacher is going to issue a problem to the student. The student will make a prediction. The teacher will observe that prediction, and if it is wrong, if it's right, they'll say that's right. If it's wrong, they'll provide the right answer, and then we'll iterate. And as before, what we're going to measure is how sort of efficiently we can cause the student to assign high probability now to the right decision root. And what we're going to do here in this interaction is something like this. We're going to build a teacher model that every time it gets an answer back from the student is going to maintain or update a belief about what the student's prior was at the beginning of the interaction. And then they'll sort of give an answer. When the student sees the answer, the student we're going to model as updating their belief about the target function to be consistent with the eventual downstream answer, assuming that the student also has some kind of probabilistic prior over possible ways that multiplication might work or whatever. And then we'll sort of repeat, where now we're assuming we're not even going to try to engage with the like exploration exploitation problem. We're assuming that at every step, the teacher is always just trying to choose sort of greedily the most informative example for the student. And what we're going to do here, in fact, not so differently from what we were doing in the previous section, is that we're going to sort of maintain in the teacher some explicit representation of the student's belief. Every time we see the student take some action, the teacher is going to update their belief about what the student's prior was, like, do I have a yellow type of student or a blue type of student? And we're going to do that by assuming sort of recursively that the student is making normal Bayesian updates in response to whatever examples the teacher is issuing. And then the teacher always, like we said before, is going to choose the new example to just maximize the posterior probability that the copy of the student that lives in the teacher's head assigns to the function that the teacher wants the student to learn. This is a lot of moving parts. I think of it really just as a version of the recipe that we had for asking questions in the first half of the talk, now nested inside some outer model that is also maintaining uncertainty about the student who's going to be interpreting the answers to those questions. Very quickly going through here, experiments in a couple of different domains. This fraction domain, learning domain we've been looking at before, sort of English past tense conjugation domain, and sort of weird mystery number crunching function that we're going to use for real human experiments. In synthetic experiments, if we assume everyone behaves according to this kind of normative model of student behavior, where we wrote down these systems that maintain explicit representations of uncertainty about what's in the student head sort of consistently do slightly better than other kinds of adaptive things, and especially things that don't represent the possibility that there might be different kinds of students who were believing different things about the problem to begin with. Question?
Yeah, sorry, for the Bayesian update, how are you modeling like the GPT-4 parameters?
So yeah, so there are no GPT-4 yet. So yeah, I guess this is actually a very important caveat. All of these tasks are like superstructured tasks where we can just generate the examples by hand. GPT-4.
Oh, sorry, I mean the model of the student.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the Bayesian update with respect to the student parameters.
Yeah.
How are you modeling student parameters if they're GPT-4?
Oh yeah. So what we're calling GPT-4 here is not making any is like a totally unstructured thing. It's literally just like the language model prompted with the conversation history and a description of the task. Yeah. So right now we're comparing this is an important thing. We're comparing a totally not language model based thing to a totally language model based thing with no external scaffolding. Question in the back.
Is it basically like this update is a tabular representation?
So it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. I think I showed it on here. And we have actually slightly different models for each of these tasks. For the addition thing, it's like this big sort of basically like hypergraph representing a bunch of different programs that you could potentially use to perform like fraction arithmetic and related operations. For the verb conjugation thing, it's like a naive Bayes model of verb conjugation that does a pretty good job of predicting human judgments there. And then for the function learning task, it also is just this like sort of factored program representation. Yeah. Okay. I know this is going by quickly, but yeah, I think really the main thing to take away here is just that in these sort of, against models of synthetic learners, we we do well by using various forms of adaptive teaching. And when we do this experiment with real human students, where we have a sort of like prolific web experiment where people have to guess some how some unknown function with a bunch of complicated parameters works. Interestingly, actually, both GPT-4 and this fancy structured method that we built do significantly better than just choosing random examples to present to the students. So our language model here is actually able to do something interesting and adaptive to student capabilities. When we either just like prompt the model to guess what it is that the student, when we prompt a language model to guess what it is that they think was in the student's head at the beginning of the interaction, or if we use this method, we are also able to actually classify, even starting from like the first turn, what kind of learner our student is. A cool thing that falls out of this is that if you look at like the actual set of examples that get chosen by these different methods, in the interest of time, I'm not going to say very much about this other than that if you look at what the sort of language model does here, it tends to prefer things that are like qualitatively easy for people, that involve small numbers and relatively simple sort of internal arithmetic problems as part of these faction problems. It has some intuitive notion of what kinds of like subtasks people find easy. This highly structured model that we wrote down doesn't. And I think, the interesting direction for future work that we haven't done yet is figure out how do you like combine whatever squishy implicit knowledge this model has about what people find easy with the sort of structured stuff that you can do in this other model to do even better. Okay, to wrap up, I think techniques for choosing optimal questions to ask teachers, you can repurpose relatively simply into techniques for asking optimal questions to sort of present to students to practice with. Doing this well in general requires being able to reason recursively, both about what the student thinks the target concept is at some moment of the interaction and the teacher's belief about what it was that the student believed at the very beginning of the interaction. And that's it. And, I think I'll say, just as a like final couple of closing points, when we imagine what the long-term version of these kinds of interactions looks like, I kind of don't think it's going to involve all of this complicated external symbolic scaffolding, and will instead involve doing something like reinforcement learning against naturalistic student simulators, maybe themselves equipped with some of this extra scaffolding at training time, but where at the end of the day, the sort of system that's asking the final questions is just some kind of big neural net. And I think there are a bunch of really important technical challenges there involved in building naturalistic student simulators and like user simulators more generally, which right now we simply don't have. Another sort of general application of these sort of systems that can ask good questions is not just for machine learning, but actually for scientific discovery, right? The sort of question of what question should I ask to maximally reduce my posterior entropy about some function that I'm trying to learn is also the sort of fundamental question of science. A lot of these optimal experiment design techniques were actually originally designed for scientific applications. And so I think there's a bunch we can do here. That beer glass example that we started the talk with was actually produced by an automated interpretability agent that was doing exactly that was sort of asking questions about some other neural model in order to try to figure out what was wrong with it. And a sort of final point here is when we think about the process by which automated decision-making systems, whether those are language models or some futuristic thing, are constructed. I think it's going to be really important for us to have tools that can, from very large numbers of people, elicit very rich descriptions of what it is that those people want these tools to do, and how, sort of in general, a thing that looks like a language model that we train in the year 2030 ought to behave. And again, I think the main bottleneck to doing that right now is just that we don't have the data or even the sort of mechanisms for getting the data about what it is that people want these models to do. And I think systems that can sort of conduct really informative interviews really efficiently are a pretty powerful tool for doing that in the future. And with that, I will wrap up. All credit to the people who actually did the work that I was talking about, Belinda, Alex, Kunal, Gabe, Valerio, Andi, and all of their advisors and colleagues and so on. Thank you very much.